How has the United States strategy in the Middle East evolved under President Biden's administration? What are China's interests in the Middle East beyond the energy security and economic ties? In what ways could the ongoing Russian and Ukrainian war influence the Middle East region? I'm Nakhavali, and this is Middle East Analitika. Dr. Efthymiopoulos, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How has the United States strategy in the Middle East evolved under the President Biden's administration, particularly in relation to countering China's influence?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I wish you the very best in the Middle East Analitika. I know it's a very good platform to do things, and I wish you really the very best.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the reason why I say this is also because the Middle East is a very interesting place that no matter the ideology, if you want, and the way that we may anticipate, probably because we're Westerners, or when we try, or when we spend a few years stating that we now know what is happening in the Middle East, we will not be absolutely right, considering that the Middle East is in constant change and constant, if you want, challenges, but also opportunities. The Middle East is a place, and the wider Middle East, the MENA region, if I may say, also, and that may include also, the Far East of the Middle East, if I can call that. Some people call it West Asia, some people call it Middle East, and so on and so forth, is full of culture, and it is full of history that it seems that we may not have learned enough into this, because at times we are trying to explain the changing geopolitical landscape that is taking place by a position that may be mature but not enough in the deep roots where these things and these challenges actually start. Sometimes we are trying to figure out why these alliances are taking shape, or why these countries change shape, and so on and so forth. So we need to take into account that cultural diversity that exists in the Middle East, and that is a very big element in the wider societies of what is known as the Middle East. Now, within the Middle East, you have different nationalities and different indigenouses, but you also have different tribes. The Gulf in specific has tribal elements, where even in Iran, for example, even Pakistan, Balochistan, and so on and so forth, you have tribes. You have tribes in Central Asia. You have tribes in the MENA region in the Middle East, and you also have tribes in south of Europe at times. Definitely different that tribalism that is defined, if you want, in the area of the Gulf, the way that we explain tribalism. But then again, where we come from and what we represent and how we represent actually matters. So for us, it's really interesting to try to explain and understand why things change and the diversity and the options actually change, considering that there are a lot of international challenges, and because the Middle East is also a passage between the West and the East overall. So this passage between West and the East has always been a passage of civilization, but also a passage where the Middle East had to play a role, and it also plays a role, especially because of the developments of history throughout the latest century, which was the 20th century. The United States is a superpower. We may not call it a superpower any longer because we have this diversity of options and powers that are either want to be or are, but nevertheless, the United States is a superpower. because of its construction abilities, because of its GDP per capita, because of its trade abilities, because of its military power, its military might, but also its political will to be engaged. In fact, the United States, as a pillar of foreign policy, bases its national policy on foreign policy objectives. China is a different story because China has gone beyond its own traditional walls, starting with different policy options and objectives. And these objectives initially started with China needing to be fed from all kinds of sources, from agricultural sources to practical sources and political sources, but also infrastructural sources. So I think through this infrastructure, they have adopted a strategy with which China actually survives first, then lives, and third, develops and employs, if you want, its own ideology. Probably also because of this lack of ideological constraints that were during the Soviet Union, where Russia was much, much more powerful than China. China overtook this role and this option by developing something new, something fresh, something that would give a lot of countries an opportunity to revive or survive or develop and so on and so on. Nevertheless, China is not at a power capacity at all levels like the United States. And what we see in the Middle East or we see in Iran is merely the start of a larger competition. We see a large competition in South China Sea. We see a large competition in Vietnam. We see a large competition in the Philippines. We see huge competition in Africa. Achievements of the Chinese negotiations, for example, was the agreement of Iran in the presence of China. But what made it much, much more huge in terms of risk was the agreement to have a presence of 5,000 Chinese troops within the soil of Iran. And that it didn't matter so much that it was in Iran, but what mattered was that China would have a foothold in what we call the Arab Sea or Persian Sea, whatever you want to call it. But nevertheless, the Arab Sea is really important. And although some people may think it's a peripheral challenge, it seems that the Chinese have an inside interest to it, which also makes it more important about the U.S. But the U.S., UK, France, Europe, and so on and so forth, it was made obvious since the past. The former colonies during the colonial powers were there also, so they always had an invested interest in that. So that makes it quite interesting that China wants to be there. The competitive level comes to what is promised to each country, what they can do or what they should do. Nevertheless, we have not put in the equation at all the fact that the Gulf countries are also developing or have developed extremely well. And I'm not talking about oil rich. I'm talking about the wealth fund economy, of the development of a society, even more education, even more statutory presence in international fora, and so on and so forth, which makes it quite interesting. And having said that, I think the Gulf countries are now negotiating the ways that things should be into balance. Now, each Gulf country, for example, has different ways of approaching it. An example through my experience, my personal experience, was the way to conduct business with the United Arab Emirates, which excluded the traditional politics level and included more trade agreements, free market economy, welcoming elements, but also negotiations for conflict resolution, which still stand. And that is really big.
So how do you differ the strategy of Biden with other administrations in the United States? Did they have any different strategy toward the region, let's say in countering China's influence?
Yeah. Let me say the following. The United States, again, from my small, humble experience, by being in the United States and by working in the United States for several years, what I understood was that the United States, and I mean, we have family in the United States, so it's quite easy to comprehend these sort of things, that the United States has a traditional role, what I said earlier. In that role, defines national policy over international engagement. This has never changed, and this will never change. And what you're actually seeing right now is the reposturing and the redrawing of the U.S. strategy versus the world. Now, there are some things that the United States does which are very important, and you may not see them so much in Europe individually for per European country, or European country in the continent of Europe on an individual basis, because they do not create a foreign policy objective which will last 100 or 150 years. Whereas the United States does this, and it brings some of the best heads to think about this future and think how things may be. So you see their drawing of the way that the United States understands the strategic map of the world. The United States, therefore, does not change strategy. It is not about survival. It is not about buying out. It is not about exploiting natural resources only. It is not only about doing good trade agreements, but it's also having good interlocutors for peace, you want to call it, for stability, for good business, and so on and so forth. You can't do business by yourself. So you need good interlocutors that are developing, and therefore you can collaborate with. You will say, but there's a big battle for natural resources, for all kinds of natural resources. And I would agree with this. But the United States has been doing this for its own interest and its own sake for many, many years. The competition lays along with the Europeans, with non-Europeans, and so on and so forth in the business world on who can be more attractive to competition, because competition up to a point is positive in nature, because that's the rule of a liberal democracy, of a liberal market economy, that you need competition to survive, which makes it more imperative for more research, more development, better logistics, better services, and so on and so forth. The United States, nevertheless, oversees this business element from the point of view of foreign policy objectives. And there are some countries that for the United States, these countries are strategic in option. It is of no coincidence that Secretary of State Blinken went to the Gulf recently and said, there's one ally that you have, which is a stable ally and which wants you to have a strong relationship, and this is the United States. And I think they were honest. One of the things that you realize once you go to the United States is that all politicians and all senators, governors, business people, whoever wants, because business is hard, their opinions are very clear cut, and their opinions are very clear to opposite to the one that they have. If they like you, they will say they like you. If they agree, they will say agree. If they don't agree, they won't agree. They will not hide something on the back. They will not negotiate on the reality. And this is a positive thing for the United States. Unlike some other countries, which they may say something and may disagree on something else because it's their location or it is their policy to not showcase what they actually mean. The United States is quite clear on this. The United States wants to have the foothold in the Gulf. It considers the Gulf as a strategic ally and a partner, has done its own share, has helped and continues to help the development of the society, and so on and so forth. The true competition is consumption. And I take it to a business level because consumption emerges further and further on for China. China consumes. And a lot of the wealth has moved in the East, and a lot of wealth has been created also in the East, whether this was from other European or American companies investing initially in China and therefore China learning or acquiring knowledge and therefore creating their own economy and therefore competitive, or because their people are consuming. And it is of no coincidence the demographics from Middle East in the East shows increasing demographics, therefore increasing consumption. Increasing development means increasing consumption, and so it goes on and on and on. And it's not only for China, for all these. Therefore, you will see a huge consumption from China. You will see a huge consumption from Pakistan. You will see huge consumption from India. You will see consumption from Singapore, further and further, or smaller countries like Vietnam or other countries that may not play a very pivotal role, but then they consume more. And in this role, the United States may not be considered as a consuming entity the way that they are consuming or they wish to consume these options and operations. And therefore, you see a small competition rising up, which actually defines world trade. That you may want to have a good trade relationship with the United States, but you know that China consumes. And you see that in everyday business. You see the consumption that they go in the Middle East. You see how many Chinese people, what they buy, and how much they buy. And you will be amazed about, how they want. And that is probably because they opened up to the world. So they discover the world now. So they want to buy property. They want to buy goods, artifacts, services, and so on and so forth. But then the United States has standards. And Europe has standards. And these standards keep the quality high. And because they keep the quality high, they can still not be compared to China. And this is where China plays now the cultural card, where linguistic elements, civilization elements, the Confucius idea of having all the if you want a complete set of culture, may open up more to China, so China can be understood better and better again. And I'm not talking about the Asian countries versus China, the ones who border China, but rather the rest of the world. You also have Japan and Korea, and they also consume it, they also create. And this is a big competition as well, because Korea and Japan are selling to the United States quite big.
Right.
And
but if I may, sorry, because I have a lot of questions, and we are left with 15 minutes. I want to get back to China. You spoke about the China's interest in the Middle East. We know that China has interest in energy security. They have many economic ties with Middle Eastern countries. But do you think that also they have some limitations in terms of expanding their influence in the Middle East?
They're not that connected with the Middle East. You said that earlier, but they're not that connected. They became steadily connected with Iran since the negotiation of 2016 that ended in 2021. They're not that connected that one may think. You may have some people traveling, but in the latest years, you've been seeing people traveling a lot from China. And the reason behind it is that there was a time that I don't know. Maybe I'm going to be a bit wrong with the dates, but when they opened up to the U.S. economy and then later on to the EU economy, there were times that they were paying people to migrate into Europe and into the United States. So I'm talking definitely after the 21st century, right? By 1990 to 2003, the economy of U.S. to China is opened, and the return of investment has been bigger from China to the U.S. and so on and so forth. And from that time onward, you see a massive flow of migration where suddenly you have small Chinatowns being opened up in different bigger or smaller cities. And that happens also in Europe, including also in Serbia where you are, or in Greece, or in Italy, and so on and so forth. Turkey goes on and on. What the second part was that they also thought that they would establish some sort of trade relations by giving them cheaper goods. So they played the cards on cheaper goods because they were cheaper, in fact. A lot of companies are based there. Their goods are created in China, and they're cheaper. So that was the connecting tie. And if I can give you some sort of examples that I know, I don't want to mention names of companies and stuff, but in 1995, there were companies setting up the telecommunications network in China. And except the fact that nobody spoke English, because I have some engineer friends who were there and stuff like that, there were no understanding of Western food or some sort of international food and so on. So there were structural problems, or being in the airport and checking some passports that they never seen before in their lives. Whereas now we understand that things are quite different. China wants to have collaborations because it consumes all ideas and all pictures that they foresee or they check and so on and so forth. But there's still a long way to go. And that's why I also consider that China is a bit overestimated, not to be underestimated, obviously, but overestimated about its abilities, probably because of demographics. Now, it is extremely risky to say this, but the reality being is that, yes, you want to be an ally to China, but definitely you want to be an ally to the United States, and that's the definitely, which is quite different to the time being. Serbia, for example, played its card with defense weapons coming from China, and there were some huge articles stating that these Chinese planes landed into Serbia, trying to buy weapons of China, and the Balkanic mentality turned around into Kosovo and Albania, which may be the case, may not be the case. But what we know of is you have the opportunity to have your sovereign rights to do and say whatever you want about China and how you want to establish a relationship with China. So Serbia, for example, which is a very good example, has established very good, strong, practical relationship with China and also with the United States, securing the position of Serbia as a peripheral power in the Balkans, no matter what the outcome was about Kosovo or the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Meaning,
I think Serbs are doing the same with Russia. That's their foreign policy. But
I think that's different. That's different with Russia, because Russia and Serbia had cultural and religious ties,
right?
Like Greece, for example, and that is an obstacle when you're trying to make judgments now.
Well, I think but the time they learned to be pragmatic.
But the Chinese, they never understood why the Chinese were there. But just to make a joke on this, the only European country that had a defense pact up until the day joined NATO was Albania. Albania had the defense pact with China. And the question being was, for those of us that do strategy, let us assume that ever, Albania would be attacked from somebody, from the West at that time, because it was a communist regime, it was a dictatorship, and so on and so forth. How would the Chinese fly over at that time with not so much technology and be secure? So now you have the total opposite, where China is an exporter of goods, of technology, of relation, and that's how they establish. Because China, for example, with Iran, going back to the Gulf, they may had a glorious past history of centuries, like Greece, like Egypt, and that is a really big issue.
Okay, let's get.
But they didn't have something concrete up until 2016 when the negotiations initially started.
Right. Let's get back to the Persian Gulf countries and other Middle Eastern countries. We know that China and U.S. have many challenges in the region. But let's talk about Middle Eastern countries, how they have been navigating their relationship with the United States and China, and actually what factors are influencing their choices.
The United States is clear-cut relationship. It's business, it's politics, it's culture, it's trade, it's direct relationship. It's because of the consumption, because of the R&D, because of their high level of education, because of their high level of experience, such as Europe, by the way. And it won't change that. But China gives you the numbers today. And China allows you to give the numbers because they consume, exactly because of consumption. And I think that's a fear factor. The consumption, like we're talking about massive investment and massive buying out of several entities and stuff. So that's a fear. Now, the other thing is, why do the Chinese do make a lot of consumption on this? And the reason behind it is because the numbers that are created, which make the Gulf a very interesting because it's an opening market. It opens the market to the world. You see the Saudis with Neom and all this changes taking place in Saudi Arabia. Or you see, for example, now the negotiation between the UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and so on and so forth. And they're interested in learning about this, but they want to be part of that internationalization because it plays in the world news every day.
Right.
And that world news creates a momentum. Right. And that's why in Europe, we need to seek, if you want the future of Europe, to continue to being attractive to positive development, to massive development that actually brings a balance rather than competition. So the Chinese are playing this card. Now, how long the Americans and the Chinese will be able to be sustained in these areas at the same time without any kind of conflict, I think we will see at some point the need for the Gulf countries to choose, because on the one hand, the United States have said already that we are the best allies, but the Chinese probably said, we are the best allies, and look what we're doing. We're having a presence through Iran through 5,000 troops. And that complicates things more. It is the option of every single country to play its, sovereign territory and options in foreign affairs. And bringing a balance between everybody is a wishful thinking. But the two countries themselves, they are already in competition directly. So imagine what happens through third or fourth countries. Look what happened, for example, with Senegal and China. Look what happened, in Central African states and the competition that there is for natural resources, including also this war-like situation that you have. Or don't forget the competition between the United States and China, having China named the base for supposedly for extraterrestrial exploration of space in Argentina, which is a recent phenomenon. And suddenly now they're looking at Cuba. So what they do is that they engage in areas where the Soviets were, and utilizing the post-Soviet momentum and also the momentum that builds up in between Russia and Ukraine is also an option for them. And that vacuum is created as an opportunity for the Chinese to be engaged further. How far they can extend it financially, I am not sure, because it seems that China is going also into a financial recession. And I also do not know whether this financial recession will actually be something that we will be saying, okay, China will now mellow down, but whether this financial recession will have an impact to the rest of the world, considering that we're interconnected somehow, somewhere.
Okay, you mentioned war between Russia and Ukraine. So let me ask you this as a last question. How do you think that the war between Russia and Ukraine would influence the Middle East, considering the potential effects and shift in geopolitical dynamics?
Huge. It has influenced a lot of countries. It has influenced the United States, has influenced China. Mind you that China has rented out a land as big as Germany in 2013, where there's no war, by the way, inside there, because probably the Chinese stated to the Russians, do not touch these areas. These are agricultural goods, because China rents out huge lands for agricultural needs. It has affected the United States because the United States is really sustaining Ukraine in a lot of things, from military to civilian assets. And it does its best to sustain it because Ukraine cannot be just lost just like that. And also because Ukraine has decided that it wants to go through the process of Euro-Atlantic collaboration. That has to be made clear to the Russians. Nevertheless, the Russians have negotiated their future with the Gulf massively. Real estate, business, markets, operations, and this and that. And in exchange, probably they give them also knowledge, know-how, support, international support in the United Nations, but also politically, for example, in negotiations between Iran and the Gulf countries. Consider what happens in Yemen, or consider what happens in other areas of regional competition between those areas. Things are changing fast, and the war in Ukraine has just accelerated. The illegal invasion of Russia into Ukraine has accelerated the need for massive need, either A, of alliances in the making, the building, which will last and will shape the market for the next 50 years with a new Iron Curtain that will eventually be implemented in the financial status. So West East, we don't know who's going to win because, as I said, the East also consumes and creates. But nevertheless, the West is the biggest consumer still, combined. Canada, the Western world, well, we know the Western world, including also Oceania, meaning New Zealand and Australia and so on and so forth. But it has affected a lot. A lot of Russians are located now in the Gulf because they can, because the Gulf has opened up to everybody. They're against the war. It's quite clear. They don't like what's happening. They don't want to be influenced, but to be concerned about volatility. But there is a momentum that built up on volatility. And mind you that there are some joint characteristics that have happened also in the Yemen war. And the characteristics is you cannot sustain an economy for a long period of time because we're interconnected somehow, somewhere. And Ukraine is also creating and consuming elements, and that created automotive problems in the buying and selling because of some certain parts that were built there and more were now have to be built in Korea or Japan, and so on and so forth. And because all this delayed, there are also changes in the goods, in the transports, in the logistics, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, they gave also the opportunity for airline companies to build on cargo momentum and therefore survive. If you remember, COVID. That COVID was more serious in that respect in bringing all economies worldwide down because the whole world went on zero at the same time. And don't forget what happened in the United States, what happened in Europe, what happened in the Gulf, and what happened in China up to a few months earlier. So we're talking still 2020, early 2023. There are still issues there with COVID. So that also brought the economy down. If it is an economic issue, yes, the Ukraine-Russia war has created problems. If it was a momentum element for the Gulf and or the whole Middle East region, yes, also that has affected and has created a momentum because they are reshaping their economies based on all people's needs. And once you come, no politics, no discussion, no arguing, no fighting, just live in peace and harmony. And that's also another option. That's a third way. That's an option. But the question is, how long can you sustain this and without taking sides? Because the Gulf states will be taking sides eventually more and more. Because they want, because they're requested, because they require, and because people want to know what is their beliefs vis-a-vis what's happening in the world. And to just finish with this, and this is most important, we have the tendency to think either as Westerners for the Gulf or Chinese or whatever East Asia for the Gulf. We need to say that the Gulf has its own thinking, its own mentality, and its own tradition. We also need to let them understand and comprehend and take a position to this. We cannot afford having other competitions in third parties and fourth parties. Unfortunately, we live in an era where day by day, the word a new iron curtain is coming up. And, eventually people and countries will have to decide. Even those that during history were not part of or sided this side or that side, eventually took sides. And eventually took sides because, Central Eastern European countries became European. Now Ukraine wants to become more close to Euro-Atlantic elements. So there are things, history is moving. It's moving things around. So eventually the Gulf, once it develops, it will be more absolute need for more balanced relationship. But the difference is that they have a different thinking because of their location. And that's why location really matters. So sometimes we need to hear out on their location and hear out on the third pillar. Maybe they can bring us into a more peaceful world than what we currently have.
Dr. Efthymiopoulos, thank you very much for joining the program, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Most welcome. The pleasure was mine, and best of luck to you, and I'm at your service anytime. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching and listening to us. Please don't forget to subscribe.